Thank you guys. Did great this morning leading us. You know that there's a difference between singing hymns and singing praise and worship. And one of the interesting parts of that we often miss is that a lot of times hymns tell a story. And praise and worship becomes more direct. You're actually telling God something. You're actually communicating with God as you sing. For example, we just sang, "I will follow you anywhere." Now, most of us, to be honest with you, were stretching the truth a little bit while we were singing that song. Let's be honest, right? I will follow you anywhere. Well, not really. We will follow you where it's comfortable. We will follow you if it's okay. We'll follow you if it's convenient. But the idea of following Christ anywhere becomes a real challenge for us. This morning, I am going to share one of my darkest secrets that I have never shared much at all with anybody. I know that my own family does not know this. None of my children were born when this happened. There may be only one person that I know of right now that's watching this service online. Vicki Kaiser might remember this dark moment in my life. I was arrested. A local police officer came to my office. Came into my office, asked me to stand up and turn around and put my hands behind my back. I was handcuffed. I was led out through the church building, and my secretary watched this happen. There were people standing in the parking lot as he took me out of the church building, handcuffed, put me in the back of a police car, and drove me to a cell. I was locked into that cell. They had the key. I was told that I had to raise my bail, and they gave me a list of phone numbers of people that I could call. We were raising money for Relay for Life, and somebody from my church paid money to have me arrested. They thought that would be a funny thing. And as I sat there in the cell, I had to raise, if I'm not mistaken, $200, and they gave me a list of phone numbers of people that I could call, most of them members of our church. Now, the complicated part of that is you really found out very quickly who your friends were. Because it would go something like this: JL, this is Steve Brown. I'm in jail, and I need some money. Would you donate $200? Click. That's how that's what I think JL would do, you know. Hello, Cecil, this is Steve Brown. I'm in jail. And I think, oh, Cecil, just too much money, so I'll cut it in half. Cecil, I need $100 to get me out of jail. Click. You know, I had to drop the price down to something that people would pay, and I had to call more people to make my bail. But I raised my $200, and when I raised my $200, that same police officer came and unlocked the cell, and I was allowed to go back. He put me in his car, drove me back to my office. I've also had some other prison experiences. I was involved in Lee County Lee Correctional, which was the state facility in South Carolina. When they closed the facility in Columbia, South Carolina, they moved it just outside of Bishopville, where I happen to be the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Bishopville. And I spent one night in the big house. I really did. Before they opened the facility to the prisoners, they invited all the civic leaders in Bishopville and in Lee County. If they would like to, they could be in lockup for one night. We went there. They fed us food just like they would feed a prisoner. They locked us in cells just that they would lock people in cells. And it wasn't fun. I thought that would be a wonderful experience for me to empathize with those guys in jail. Listen, when they give you a mattress that's about that thick and that's what you sleep on, and the pillow is almost flat enough that you can put your head onto that mattress, and you've eaten the worst meal that you've ever had in your life, they say it's good, but it wasn't good. But there's something unique about hearing that jail cell clink and know you're there for the night. That involved prison ministry. And I started going to Lee County Correctional every Monday night with a group from our church. And mostly the facility had been cut in two. On one side of the facility, we had youthful offenders. Some as young as 14, 15, and 16 imprisoned. On the other side, they had what they called the hardliners, the long-term guys. These are guys that were there probably for the rest of their lives. I didn't get an awful lot with the long-term folks, but Monday after Monday after Monday, I met with youthful offenders. I met with some kids 18, 19, 20 years old. We'd have a room probably as many as 50 people sitting in a big circle. And there was something about being there and hearing those doors clang shut behind you. Jan and I did a Sunday morning service there, and she went with our choir. We took our choir, and she got physically ill when the doors began to shut. You go through a series of doors. Clink. You're in a place and they lock this door, they unlock this door, and then you go in. And we went into a big room, which was the chapel that we got built before it was there. And you could look into the faces of some of those young guys, and it wouldn't be much different than looking at Evans or Preston or Macy's face or Crenshaw's or Matt's. They didn't look like hardened criminals. They didn't look like guys that did bad things. And yet they were there because they had been arrested, they had been tried and convicted, and were now living out a sentence. I've shared with you before one night coming home from prison ministry, which usually we were through about 8 o'clock or so, and we would come back home, and I came through the back door of our house, and Tori, who was our youngest at that time, probably not more than 3 or 4 years old, and you came down a hallway into our den, and the phone was at the end of the sofa. It was a landline. And as I came around the corner, I heard Tori say this on the phone: "My daddy's not here. He's in jail." Click. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, who did she just tell that I was in jail? And I tried to ask her, who is that? Somebody, a man. And fortunately, it was one of the men from church who, when I came Sunday morning, was in hysterics and wanted to know how my jail term went. But we think about prison, we think about jails, we think about being locked up, we think about being arrested, and none of that sounds good to us, does it? But when you look in the mirror, when you look into the mirror of our faith and you get a reflection of who you genuinely are, one of the things that you need to see is that you're a prisoner. That you're a prisoner of Christ. I want to give you 2 instances where Paul used that terminology. In the book of Ephesians, Paul is in prison when he writes the book of Ephesians, by the way, and he's writing from a jail cell, and he says this: "For this reason, I, Paul, the prisoner of Christ Jesus, for the sake of you Gentiles." And then he goes on to make a statement. In a few moments, we're going to turn to chapter 4 and hear that statement again, but what does it mean when Paul says, I, Paul, a prisoner of the Lord, of Jesus Christ, for the sake of the Gentiles? First and foremost, it means that the arrestor has become the arrested. Do you remember how the story of Paul begins for us when his name was Saul? In the early part of the book of Acts, we're told that there was a man named Stephen, and that Stephen had stood before the Sanhedrin and had given a defense of the faith, and he so offended the Sanhedrin that they took him outside and stoned him to death. You remember the story, don't you? And Stephen, while he's being stoned, he says, "I'm looking into heaven and I see Jesus. I see him standing at the right hand of the Father." And it just made them throw the rocks even harder. And at the end of that chapter, it says that they took their coats off and they laid them at the feet of a man named Saul. That was Paul. The very next chapter says, and Saul went to the chief priest. Now, he didn't go to the political leaders. He didn't go to Rome to get this permission. He went to the Jewish leaders of that day who had their own police force, who had their own guards. And he said, "Give me the authority, give me letters or give me authority, and I will go and arrest some more Stephens. There's more of them out there, and I will arrest some more, and I'll bring them back bound to you. I will arrest them, and I'll bring them to jail. And you can get rid of more of these people. Just give me the authority to do it. It's amazing how the arrestor became one who was arrested. Here's Paul now. Where is he? He's in a prison. Why is he in a prison? He's in a prison because he's been preaching to the Gentiles. Preaching to the Gentiles didn't bother the Romans. Didn't bother them at all. He could preach to whoever he wanted to, and they wouldn't have been upset. But preaching to the Gentiles caused the Jewish population to rise up against him, and they began to make accusations that this guy is causing a ruckus in our town. He's upsetting the status quo. He is disturbing us by doing something that we think he shouldn't ought to do. And so they had him arrested, and he was placed basically for disturbing the peace, would be a good way to do that. And there he is in prison, and he's writing to the Ephesian church. He's writing to Ephesus, and he says, I'm a prisoner. Why am I a prisoner? I am a prisoner because I am following my calling. What happened on the road to Damascus when Saul at that time is going down to Damascus and saying, I'm going to arrest some of these people on the way. He had an experience with the risen Christ. Do you remember that? A light shone around him. He fell to his knees, and a voice said, Saul, why are you doing this? And he says, who are you, Lord? Yeah. I want you to go down to Damascus, go to a street called Straight, go to a certain house on that street called Straight, and you wait, and I will send somebody to you. And while Saul is waiting in a house, blinded, said he hadn't eaten anything, he hadn't drank anything, he was in this total isolation, God calls a guy named Ananias. He says, Ananias, I want you to do something for me. I want you to go down to a certain house on a certain street in Damascus. And you're going to find a man named Saul. You know what Ananias did? You know what the first thing Ananias said? He's not going to arrest me. We know who he is. He's the arrester. He's the guy that's got authority to arrest people like me. God, are you sure that you want me to do that? And God said, yeah, and I want you to tell him something very specific. I want you to tell him that I've chosen him. And I want you to tell him that his calling in life, his purpose in life, the very reason that I created him was so that he would preach the gospel to the Gentiles. Listen how this story unfolds. Ananias goes to the street called Straight. He enters in at that house that he's instructed to go to, and there's Saul, blinded, not able to see, hungry, not been eating, not been drinking. Total confusion in his life. He knows that something's happened, but the conclusion has not been drawn yet. And Ananias says, Brother Saul, read the text. Brother Saul, I'm here to tell you that God has chosen you. I'm here to tell you that God has called you to take the good news to the Gentiles. And the text says that the scales fell from his eyes, and Brother Saul could see. That was a calling. That was a purpose. That was God interacting with Saul, saying, Saul, what you're about to do, I have chosen you specifically. Do you think that Saul may have turned around and said to God, but listen, I'm a really good Jew, and I'd be better equipped to go to the Jews. I've gone to Jewish school. I know how to be Jewish. I know what the law is. I know how to apply that. And I know what the prophet said. Wouldn't I be better equipped to go to the Jews? But Saul, you've got the fortitude, and you've got the demeanor, and you've got the character to color outside the box. So I want you to go to the Gentiles. And by the way, Saul, it ain't going to be easy. The one that had the authority to arrest has now been arrested. What did he say? I, Paul, the prisoner of Jesus Christ, for the sake of you Gentiles. There's enough in that one statement, for the sake of you Gentiles. If we started to unfold that, I don't think that we would be here for weeks trying to figure out all that meant. I'm here today because of people like you. I don't want you to see that as harsh. I don't want you to see that as bad. I just want you to understand that I am so dedicated to my calling, I'm willing to go to jail so that you might understand Christ and the calling He has in your life. Do you hear that? I am so convinced that God has chosen me, that God has called me, and that God has given me this purpose. I will go to jail for that cause. Is there anything at all in your life today that you'd be willing to go to jail for? Not because you committed a crime, but because you might upset the apple cart. Is there a place that you would be willing to go that's outside the boundaries of taking the gospel, knowing that the risk might be that you could be arrested there? Would you be like the two young ladies who went into North Korea to take the gospel and they were arrested? Would you be like some of those underground followers of Christ that are in China that disappear just mysteriously? They're no longer there any longer. Would you be willing to be that person? My friend who used to go into North Korea as an educator talked to me. He was a missionary to China, but he would cross the border every now and then, go into North Korea, and he would talk about putting on certain clothing. He would talk about covering his head. He even talked about stooping over so that he would look shorter because he was a tall man, and tallness would isolate him as being a foreigner. He would talk about going to the underground churches. I've sat at his table many times, and he would tell me story after story about going to places and homes where they had church going on. And they would be sitting around the table, maybe 5 or 6 people, and it would give the impression that they were playing cards and they were quoting Scripture to each other. They couldn't sing because that would be heard, but they would do the lyrics of songs, and there they were sitting around a card table with cards, pretending to play cards while they were worshiping God. Boy, that wouldn't go over well in a Baptist church, would it? He would talk about the man who had the job, whose job it would be to stand in the marketplaces. And when those underground Christians wanted to know where the next worship service would be, they knew that he would know. And they would come up and they would make the sign of an ichthus in the sand, a fish, quickly covered up. And he'd say, they're meeting at the Trahan's house tomorrow night. Next week, we're going to meet at the Lofton's house. But he often said that every now and then, that person would just disappear. They wouldn't see him anymore. He would be gone. Oftentimes assumed that he had been thrown into a jail or a prison somewhere. Sometimes even thought that they may have even been executed. Their families sometimes would never know what happened to them. They just know that they went out one day and disappeared and never came back. They were found. I said to him once sitting at his table, that must have been a church job hard to get people to do. He said, no, they stand in line for that job. When one disappears, there's one standing ready to do it again. And when that one disappears, there's another one standing ready to be out there. The underground church, he says, will not go under. They may not be able to be flashy and big and have big steeples and pipe organs and have all kinds of music, but there are these faithful followers of Christ who are putting on the line every day, are willing to be arrested so that their fellow Koreans could hear the gospel. Stories like that come out of China. Stories like that come out of Russia. Stories like that come out of Muslim countries where people go in and they know at the risk of being arrested. They don't go in upsetting the apple cart. They simply go in proclaiming the gospel. And because people do not want the gospel proclaimed, they're arrested, sometimes called spies. Saul, who once was the arrester, had now become the arrested. Why? Because he had been called to share the gospel. There's a second concept here that I think is interesting. He was bound, but free. Okay, understand what I'm saying? He was bound, he was in prison, he was locked up, but he was still doing what God had called him to do. He was still preaching to the Gentiles. Jump over to chapter 4 for a moment. Look at the first verse there. Therefore, I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling which you have been called. What's he saying? I'm demonstrating what it means to walk in because of my calling. I am here in prison today because I am following my calling. I want you to do the same thing. I want you to walk in a worthy manner of the calling with which you have been called. In a few moments, we're going to take a closer look at that. I need for us to understand today that we have been called, and at great risk sometimes in our future, or maybe even now, that calling may put us in jeopardy. We live in a country where we have freedom. The problem is that we are free, and yet we're bound. I want you to understand the opposite of what I just said. I am free, and yet I feel bound up to do absolutely nothing. I'm free to do it, I don't do it. I'm free to proclaim the gospel. I am free to interact with the people's lives. I'm as free can be, and yet I'm bound up spiritually. Listen to what Paul said. Listen to what I said a few moments ago. Paul was bound up, but in his bound upness, he found freedom to do what his calling was. Do you know? Are you understanding the opposition there? I am free today. We're in a free country, and we can proclaim the gospel to whoever we want to, and yet we don't do it. Here's Paul says, I've been bound up for doing it. I've been put in prison to do it, and I'm still successful in my calling. I just keep doing it. That's what it means to be a prisoner for Christ. Being a prisoner for Christ means that even if I'm arrested, even if I'm bound up, even if there's a part of me that's been restricted, I still do it because my calling dictates what I do. Down through history, there have been many who have given their lives. There have been many who have been imprisoned because they followed their calling. I want you to understand today that there's nothing at all that can take you away from your calling except you. They may imprison you. They may bind you. They may take away your ability to speak, and yet you can still follow your calling. Paul said, I'm a prisoner, but I just keep preaching, and I keep teaching. It's where hopelessness gives way to hope. But I want you to hear what Paul says. Here's what your calling is. Here's what I want you to follow. I want you with all humility and gentleness. All right, understand where our calling begins, with humility and gentleness. Our calling to be a follower of Christ does not begin with anger and critique. It doesn't begin with me being boastful and standing up and saying, I'm a follower of Christ and you should do this. That's not where we begin. We begin as humble. And we begin with gentleness. We are patient. We show tolerance. Oh, take your Bible right now. Everyone that's got a written Bible, and circle that word tolerance. Make it bold. Put stars in the margin. Draw arrows to it. Do what you need to do to hear the word that Paul says to them. You show tolerance for one another. Why? Because you're bound in love. What is tolerance? Tolerance means you put up with the other person. You're patient with the other person. You have tolerance towards somebody. Christianity is never to be intolerant. Being a follower of Christ and being a prisoner for Christ does not mean that I have to protect or defend Christianity. I should be tolerant and patient and gentle and humble, being diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Now, I used this illustration in Sunday school this morning, and I want to use it here just for a moment. Every one of us are different. But you three over here, we're going to call you backsliders. Doesn't Jim just look like a backslider to you? Sally, it's because you're associating with Jim, all right? And Alex, you just sat in the wrong spot today. And Eric, you're a backslider too, okay? So you're all backsliders. How many of you know what a backslider is? It's a dumb terminology that we Baptists use sometimes. It means that you got saved, but you're not acting like you're saved, so you've backslid. I don't believe in backsliding, by the way. This group right here, we're going to call you, let's see what we're going to call this group right here. We're going to call you the non-Baptist of our group, okay? So you can pick whatever you want to be. You can be Catholic, you can be Presbyterian, you can be United Methodist, but you be the non-Baptist, okay? You're all non-Baptist back there. Now, this large group right here, we're going to put you in the North River category. You're all members of North River Baptist Church, and you are perfect, okay? You are loved. You love each other. You're good folks. So we're gonna make you the perfect people. Now, you folks over here on the far right, we're going to put you at a church. It's a First Baptist church somewhere that's extremely large. You pick whichever one you want to be, okay? First Baptist church somewhere that's extremely large. All right, so let's watch how this happens sometimes. We come over here and we say, well, you people aren't right. You know, we're going to critique you people because you ain't right. You're backsliding. You don't go to church anymore. You're starting to do stuff you shouldn't ought to do. And you're acting bad. So therefore, there's something wrong with all of you that are backsliders. Then I'm going to say this group over here, there's something wrong about all of you because you ain't Baptist. Okay, so if you're not Baptist, then there's something wrong with you. You're out of sorts. And if you ever just got baptized the right way and became a Baptist, then you would be okay. But we got questions about all of you because you're not Baptist. You folks are perfect. You North River people are perfect. All right? You're fine just the way you are. You come to church every Sunday. You're involved in things. You're good people. Now this group over here, they go to a big church. And because they go to a big church, they think that God has blessed them more than any small church. Okay? So they think that because they go to a particular large environment that God has blessed them and that they are somewhat privileged, especially when you start looking at little churches. We're the big church. You need to be more like us, and we don't need to be more like you. Okay, it's real easy to divide people into groups, isn't it? But what unifies us? What is it that I should find that is the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace? What I want to know about you folks over here is, do you love Jesus? Have you been forgiven? Do you understand that grace has been applied to your life? You may be out of sorts with that right now, but if Sally turns around and says, I'm not like Jim. I love Jesus. I've been redeemed. I may not living it the way that I want to right now. And what happens if you Presbyterian, Methodist, Catholic, whatever it is over here that you are, and all of you say the same thing to me is, I love Jesus. I've been a follower of Christ. He's forgiven me of my sins. I don't have to bother with all of you folks because I've already instructed you and indoctrinated you in what the right answers are. So you're always going to give me the right answers. Whether it's right or wrong, you're always going to tell me the right answers because you're part of the group, see? And so I can say, you know, all of you will say, oh, I've been redeemed, I've been baptized the right way, all this kind of stuff. I love Jesus. And you folks over here, although some of the folks at that big old church that you go to does not understand one bit about what it means to love Jesus, you might say to me, I love Jesus. His grace is a part of my life. Did you know that put every one of us into the same category? We have become brothers and sisters in Christ. And all that divides us becomes irrelevant. We may help each other understand the differences in our lives. We may be a person that comes along, but I'm going to be tolerant even for the folks at the big church. I'm going to be tolerant of folks that are outside my own denominational beliefs. I'm going to be tolerant for backsliders. Why? Because that's following my calling of what it means to be a follower of Christ. Paul said, be careful that when you're bound, be careful when the pressure's on, that you're continuing to walk worthy of your calling. How'd that play out? Paul and Silas are imprisoned. They're in jail one night. And at midnight, they begin to sing praises to God. Why? Because that's their calling. That's who they are. They're followers of Christ. And although they're chained to the walls, they're singing praises to God. And I love how this unfolds. At midnight, the earthquake hits, and the prison doors swing open, and the chains fall off of them. And their hopelessness now becomes hope. And they walk out and they say to a Philippian jailer, don't do yourself any harm. We're all here. We haven't gone anywhere. And we want you to know that you don't have to take your own life. The man who had beat him, the man who had chained him up, the man who locked the door behind him, the man who imprisoned him, they stood worthy of their calling and said, you don't have to hurt yourself. We're all here. We haven't gone anywhere. I like the way that story unfolds because it says the Philippian jailer did what? He took them to his house. He bound their wounds. He took care of them. He found Jesus that night and they became one. But do you remember how that story continues? We often don't see the last part of the story. Let me tell you, if I wrote the story, this is how I'd write it. Paul and Silas were singing praises to God because they wanted to get back at that Philippian jailer, and they were so vengeful and they were so hateful that they just wanted to say, God, rock these prison doors open so we can say to them, I told you so. That'd be me. And when the prison doors swung open, I'd be the first one to say, ha, 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 thought you had me, didn't you? By God's bigger than your God. And I'd flee. I'd get out of there. I'd be gone. But do you know how that story ends? The Philippian jailer, at Paul and Silas' insistence, take them back to jail. Did you hear that? Growing up, I heard it preached, and Paul and Silas were free, and they just got out of there. No. Read the text again. It says that the Philippian jailer took them back to jail. Did he chain them up? I don't know. But he took them back to jail. Because the next morning, it says that the rulers sent word to bring us those guys that we've got in jail. And the Philippian jailer brought them out. Set them free. On the authority of his magistrate, he unlocked the door for them and set them free. But they remained prisoners. They remained prisoners. Folks, we're too busy trying to be combative with the world and trying to get even with the world and trying to be vengeful to the world and trying to say to them, you mistreat me, my God's going to mistreat you. Go ahead, mistreat me, because my God is going to get you. Joseph went out in the fields one day, and his brothers locked him in a pit, sold him into slavery. They took him down to Egypt. When he got to Egypt, a man named Potiphar bought him as a slave, took him to his house. He was such a good slave that Potiphar said, I'm going to make you the best slave. I'm going to make you the top slave in my household. I'm going to give you the responsibility of my household. And Joseph took care of the household. And then the day came when the master Potiphar went on a journey. He said to Joseph, take care of things while I'm gone. And Joseph was seduced by Potiphar's wife. Trying hard to guard my words here, but I think we're all adults. She made a move on Joseph, called him up to the household, wanted him to take advantage of the situation. And Joseph said, no, 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 not me. Says he fled from the house and that she grabbed his loincloth. She had his boxers. And when Potiphar came home, Potiphar said, how's it been? And Potiphar's wife said, you know that guy Joseph? Let me tell you what he did. He came up the house and tried to take advantage of me. I got his drawers right here. And Potiphar had him thrown where? Into prison. What had Joseph done to be thrown into a pit? What had Joseph done to be sold into slavery? What had Joseph done to be put into a prison in Egypt? And one day while in prison, there was a baker and a butler. And they both had dreams. And Joseph said, I can help you out with those dreams. And he said, one of you, the goose, is not very good. You're going to be beheaded. But the butler, the baker, if I'm not mistaken, you're going to go back to Pharaoh's house and you're going to continue to serve Pharaoh. It happened just the way that Joseph said. And he said to the man, now when you get to Pharaoh, tell him about me, that I'm innocent. Tell him that I'm good. But the man never did that and left him in prison. Until one day, Pharaoh woke up and had a dream. And nobody could interpret the dream. There's a bunch of skinny cows that ate a bunch of fat cows. And Pharaoh says, I don't know what this is all about. And the butler said to him, hey, I know a guy. Met him in jail. While I was serving time in the big house, I was incarcerated with this guy. And this guy interpreted a dream for me, and it came out just the way he said it would be. And Pharaoh said, go get that guy. And he went and got Joseph. Joseph said, let me tell you about your dream. You're going to have 7 years of bumper crops where you're going to have more than enough. But then you're going to have 7 years of famine where there's not going to be enough. Pharaoh said, what shall I do? What shall I do? And Joseph said, I got an idea. On those years that you got a bumper crop, why don't you just take some of the extra, put it in barns, and when you have 7 years of leanness and 7 years of famine, you'll have food enough to give to everybody. You know who got hungry during those 7 years of famine? Joseph's brothers. And one day they said, go to Egypt. Dad sent them to Egypt and said, go to Egypt. They have food in Egypt. They have some guy there that's in charge of the food supply. And when they came in, Joseph recognized his brothers, sold him into slavery, put him in a pit, said to his father, a lion has eaten Joseph. Here's the bloody cloak. Accused of rape, thrown into prison, forgotten by someone that had an answer to his problems. I think all that might have welled up in me if I were Joseph, and I would have said to the people, you take those guys right there and tell them to get out of Egypt. Don't give them a bite of food. But can you imagine that moment when Joseph encounters his brothers? And they're standing there, and not only has he got grain for them, but he has laid out a feast. Man, they had a homecoming feast. It was dinner on the grounds there in Egypt. They had more than enough. And when they went in and sat at the table, they said, yep, they're going to kill us. They're giving us our last meal. It's not going to fall out that way. And the scripture says that Joseph stepped from behind the curtain and he confronted the brothers who had treated him. Don't know how many years he spent in the big house, but Joseph had done a jail term that wasn't good and pleasant. There's a part of me that says, go after him, Joseph. Unload on him, Joseph. Get your vengeance. Get revenge. Make this right, Joseph. And he says to his brothers, you don't even recognize me, do you? I'm your younger brother, Joseph. Oh, my goodness. Could you not see their countenance fall? Could you not see them turning pale and white as a ghost? Could you not see them saying, uh-oh. And there's my younger brother, who we said was dead, sold into slavery, been in prison, all these things, standing with the authority of the food supply for all of Egypt. And what did Joseph do? He remained firm to his calling. Everything that's happened to me is so that I can take care of you right now. Give them more than enough to eat. Go back home, get my father and the rest of the family, and move to Egypt, and I will take care of you. Just a few days ago, a man was released from prison who had spent 5 decades, 50 years, for a rape that he did not do. DNA testing has proven that he is an innocent man. And with humility and gentleness and tolerance, that man stood outside the prison doors and said, my hopelessness has been turned to hope. In other words, I'm not going to live there anymore. I'm going to live in hope. I may be a prisoner, you may be a prisoner. We are all prisoners of Christ. But that doesn't mean we live in hopelessness. It means that we live with hope. Because one day, our God will set us free. Dear Father, remind us every day that being a prisoner for Christ is not a bad thing. It's not our defense. It's not because we've been bad that God punishes us by putting us in prison. It's because He imprisons us sometimes to open up the opportunities for others. So, Father, for the cause of Christ, we would be willing to be arrested. We would be willing to be a prisoner. We would be willing to be bound by something if it means that our calling could take us to those who need to hear it. May we be prisoners that at midnight sing praises unto you. May we be prisoners that when the prison doors are open, we don't go anywhere because there's the sake of a jailer that we need to minister to. May we be the kind of prisoners that when the doors are open and we find ourselves face to face with our accusers, we don't look at our accusers with anger and vengeance as many Christians today do against those who persecute them. But rather we would say to them, all of that's behind us. Let me tell you about grace and forgiveness and love. May we find ourselves not as hardened criminals who hate the world, but rather as those who have been redeemed and been set free. May we realize that our chains are gone. And because our chains are gone, we are free.